what made me want to do this project was deeply personal. And as I have continued with it, it has become so much more about the people I get to connect with.
Hello, print friends, and welcome. This is a bilingual podcast, so if you subscribe to us, you'll get episodes in English with me, as well as in Spanish with Reynaldo Gil Zambrano. Together, we speak with people around the globe about their practice and passions in the field of print media and multiples. This episode is brought to you by Legion Paper. Legion Paper is a fine art paper company that represents the best papers in the world. They either stock it, source it, or make it with brands like Stonehenge, Somerset, Coventry, Reeves, Arches, and more. Legion is the best paper resource for every artist and printmaker's needs. Learn more about the variety of papers Legion stocks at www.legionpaper.com. Print friends, I am partnering with Print Austin to bring you an exciting giveaway. A 2-week printmaking residency in Thailand. You heard that right. 2 weeks making prints in a tropical paradise, eating world-renowned cuisine. You can apply directly through the Print Austin website, and I have an exclusive discount code for my listeners. Use the code PRINTFRIEND on your application, and it brings the fee down to just $25. Check out the link in the show notes for more information. My guest this week is Eliza Lutz, a musician, printmaker, and PhD student in linguistics based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Eliza is also the recipient of Print Austin's Best in Show Award for their work in the contemporary print, an exhibition on view now through March 20th. In our conversation, we discuss Eliza's journey from running a record label in a streaming-dominated world and working in the DIY screen printing scene to becoming a fine art printmaker, the complexities of the American healthcare system, and how printmaking serves as an extension of their disabled body. Hi, Eliza. How's it going?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I am really excited to chat with you. I was introduced to your work through the Print Austin show, The Contemporary Print, in which you were awarded Best in Show. So we can definitely talk about that and that piece a little bit later on. And then part of that was I get the opportunity to talk with you. And so I've been spending a week or two doing a deep dive on your work and finding everything I can, and just really been taken with your practice and the multifaceted nature of it. And so I'm just really excited to get an opportunity to learn more about you and your work and share it with the Hello Print Friends.
Thanks for having me. And I'm definitely excited to talk about printmaking with print nerds, because that's a whole other realm than just talking to about anybody else.
Exactly. You start about 16 layers deep already when you're talking with print nerds, which is very fun, very satisfying if you're used to starting with, if you imagine a block of wood and you carve that.
Exactly.
Yeah. I always start my interviews by inviting my guests to introduce themselves and answer those questions that are who you are, where you are, what you do.
My name is Eliza Lutz. I'm a printmaker primarily lately. I think I used to do some painting and music stuff, but it's been more focused on printmaking the last few years. Living and working in New Mexico, where I was born and raised. And I'm also a PhD student in linguistics, so always trying to blend my academic side with my artistic practice in ways that I think are fun, that they inform each other in kind of unique ways.
Yeah, I feel like I've got a very pop interest in linguistics. I've always found it really fascinating, and language is really fascinating. And I will bore people to death about the Thai language and how it works and why it's easier than some languages and harder than others, and talk to them about linguistic cognates. And then when I actually tried to take a linguistics course in undergrad, I was like, I'm not memorizing the parts of my tongue. I was so not into the actual nitty-gritty of it.
To the field, and there are the people that love to do that part, the phonetics part, and there are people who are like, absolutely not. I took that. I had to take it. I'm done with it, and I'm never picking it up again.
Amazing.
I think any interest in linguistics is good interest in linguistics from the perspective of a linguistics person. I think it's similarly nerdy and niche as printmaking.
I agree. Like, it seems like either you get it and it lights you up, or you're like, why would you do that?
Or everyone in the social gatherings' eyes just glaze over and they're like,
Mhm.
you could talk about printmaking. Maybe that was slightly less boring. No.
Yeah, if you could go back to print. So you said that you grew up in New Mexico, and I always love to also ask my guests, what role did art play in that part of your life? Were you a kid who was always drawing? Were you a kid who went to museums all the time? Were you a comic books kid? What was that visual landscape and art, or quote unquote fine art, and its role in that part of your life?
Yeah, I came to printmaking fairly early, but in a route that I think is common to many printmakers I've since met, which is more through the screen printing, DIY, punk rock, zine culture side. So I grew up here in New Mexico. I think I was born in Albuquerque and lived there until I was about 11, and then moved to Santa Fe, which I lived until about 2021. So stayed there a long time. And both areas, huge art communities. So I think I was surrounded by a lot of fine art, craft from a young age, and really was an artistic kid. I had a difficult, chaotic childhood, so art was always a really strong outlet from an early age. And I found my way to screen printing initially because we had a really incredible teen art center in Santa Fe called Warehouse 21. So I think I moved up there when I was about 11, and then I was 12. They had a ton of different punk rock shows, metal shows, emo shows, all kind of run by kids, which I think was the really unique part of that space. And it was very scrappy, like a very scrappy teen center, which I think was the part that made it so magic. And I can't remember exactly, it's been so long, but I think I got caught like drinking or smoking in the parking lot. And the person that was running the show was like, I'm not going to call your parents, but you have to come to this screen printing workshop Saturday or like tomorrow or whenever. And I was like, oh, that sounds so dumb. And I went, and it was very scrappy screen printing, but I think that's probably why I loved it. It felt more accessible maybe to a scrappy kid like me, in this kind of like shack-like building in the back of the main structure. And we were just burning screens with the sun and halogen lights, and it was very rustic. But like for a kid that I think was dealing with a lot of trauma and feeling very like disempowered, and like I didn't have a means to communicate things that I was dealing with, screen printing was like just amazing. I was like, I can put whatever I want on a shirt. I can put whatever my friend wants on a shirt. And that was just gave rise to being someone that liked to draw, someone that liked to paint. Oh, now I can just replicate these designs and falling in love with that replication, repeatable side of printmaking early. But I think it really stayed there. I didn't really try other kind of accessible printmaking mediums like lino cut or anything, or stamp making till much later, but I just loved the culture around DIY screen printing, and getting really involved in music for many years was more of my focus, and making merch for bands that I was in, my friends' bands, and the kind of artistic communication of just approaching that in really off the cuff ways was always fun. And then it wasn't really until like the pandemic when I was reevaluating. At that time, I was like, I ran a record label and was booking music full time for a living. And so all of that came to an utter halt, which was really devastating. And I think the interesting other side of that was that I also felt a little bit relieved, because I think I was so burnt out from just that kind of grind that I just started Googling, as you do, and found, oh, wow, like all those weird random credits I took at the community college after I dropped out of high school are somehow usable. They're not expired, these dusty old credits. And I went and found a linguistics program that was a BA MA program, since I hadn't gone to university before. And because I had taken some art classes at the community college, and they have this incredible printmaking studio at UNM, I was like, oh, that'll be easy. I'll just cross this like art minor off while I'm on my linguistics way. And so I did an intro to printmaking class, and I just fell in love with intaglio. monotype printing as well, and continued to take classes there. And then really this whole other side, I think I just thought, well, I'm just going to do linguistics. And now I'm like, okay, I've got this foot in both worlds because I can't let the printmaking go. So I think I hadn't really focused on like the fine art side until more recently, because everything was in this more DIY merchandising kind of culture. Those are interesting. Should they be so divided? I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. No, that I was just thinking about that too, that idea of how exactly is making a t-shirt that, let's say, you're going to sell at a concert, right? You want to make it communicative, you want to make it interesting visually, and with the end result hopefully of somebody wanting to purchase it. And then how where is that line of it being so different if you look at a small precise little intaglio work, which I know you do, these really little intimate cut plate intaglio pieces. But I feel like it's still, you want it to be interesting, you want it to communicate, you want it to connect with people. So it's like that underlying impetus remains the same, but the aesthetic on the other side is what really makes us put it in two different categories, hey?
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And I think for me, I really liked to push the art form of kind of DIY merchandise. What do I mean by that? Besides just making a regular t-shirt or like CD case, vinyl case, whatever, could you make it a more complex message, which is where I think the more conceptual side of fine art practice is more interwoven with that for a lot of people, myself included. Maybe that's where I was exploring that side of an art practice early on. So I don't know, making one of my albums was a fabric swatch kit. So each were these like printed fabrics and then these swatches for each song and just weird stuff, very nerdy, nerdy merch, but in that way that was like, how can we make these interesting compendiums of different kinds of prints and not just having like a flat poster or a flat shirt, but these kind of dynamic items that people want to take with them, especially starting a record label, a DIY record label in the era of streaming. It's like you're almost put in a position of trying to make more interesting memorabilia, like physical items that people can connect with in this age where so much of music merchandising is digitized, music experiences is digital. And I think people very much want to interact with like physical, and that's not so different, I think, than the fine art world, right? And discussions around looking at something on Instagram versus being in person with it.
I think it's significant that when people do buy music objects to interact with now, they're buying vinyl records, right? They're either streaming or buying something on vinyl because that physicality of vinyl is so cool and so intimate, that the heaviness of it, the size of it, the ritual of getting up and turning it over again halfway through. It's an experience, I think, more akin to experiencing physical art too. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
How do you feel like your relationship to image making changed, if it changed at all, when you started to work in this? We keep saying like fine art with scare quotes, right? Because we all know it's a construction, but it is in there. When you started to make not like the merch and adjacent to music world, but like the art object in and of itself for its own sake, did that change the way you thought about image making? Did it change the way you thought about the functionality of the finished pieces when you started to do this intaglio side of your practice?
I think it did. And I think an interesting parallel experience taking place that informed that kind of transition was that in addition to going through this pandemic that we were all experiencing and grappling with at the time, where I was deciding to change gears and move more from music to back to school, and coming into fine art printmaking in that way at that time, was couple years before that. For a few years, I'd been really struggling with my physical health a lot. And it was actually, I spent several years chasing issues with some chronic illnesses that I was having, and made it like to the Mayo Clinic in January 2020. So like right before. And I think through finally getting some answers related to some different chronic illnesses I'd been dealing with, and finally having a name and maybe not a solution, but a path forward for treatment. I think that really opened the doors to processing a lot of grief simultaneous to like this new window of exploring identity through this experience of chronic illness and what that meant for me as this pretty like big life change. I mean, it really significantly, my health had changed. You know, I went from running marathons to having to use mobility aids and just a lot of issues that were pretty drastic on the one hand. But at the same time, I think maybe because of COVID and being a little bit more online and isolated in some ways that were negative for that experience, in other ways, it forced me to find online community, becoming a lot more educated about disability justice movements, and really having quite a awakening around my own internalized ableism, experiences with a lot of mental health issues from when I was younger and putting those into a different lens. And so I think grappling with those things and having something like printmaking and the fine art side of printmaking brought into my life in full force was this amazing opportunity to be like, I'm just going to explore this in whichever way it comes out. And for me, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, like printmaking has really been like my art practice, my way of approaching making with printmaking just really is like an extension of my disabled body. And so I think it was just such a perfect marrying of those two things, finding that medium and that practice at the same time as I was grappling with those experiences, both the physical, but also just the identity. I don't want to say crisis because it was more like a rebirth, but
yeah, because one of the themes I've seen in your work is that you use the human body a lot, either like just an eye or just a hand or the full body itself. And the piece that was shown at the Contemporary Print in Print Austin, I think really seemed to speak to that in some of the imagery you were using. But it also was a pretty innovative and ambitious just art object that used print, I feel like. So I would love to maybe start with just having you explain just the physicality of the work that was shown. And it's the First Impressions series. Is that correct? The name of it?
yeah. Yeah, so
Okay.
the First Impression series I've been working on for a few years now. And it started with this idea, going back to what I was saying about just my, changing my relationship to my body through my experience of chronic illness, both in that visceral experience of dealing with physical symptoms, but also in a more kind of cerebral, like expanding my perceptions of self and space through that. Lost my train of thought.
Yeah, it's okay. We edit everything. It's going to sound so
Yeah,
smooth. Don't even worry.
my chronic brain fog. But I loved your question, so just give me a second. Yeah. So through some of those kind of internal mental changes, ruminating on these topics, I came to this idea, maybe because I was specifically granted a disabled parking placard for like accessible parking, and kind of thinking about like the icons of disability, like the iconography around it. And many people have talked about this before, but this kind of static symbol of a person in a wheelchair, and how that kind of creates this like monolithic impression of what disability is. It's often makes it more limited to physical disabilities, but even within physical disabilities that you have to be visibly disabled or use a wheelchair, or even maybe in a more nuanced way, not be an ambulatory wheelchair user, all these sorts of limited perceptions of what disability looks like. And as I was exploring that both in myself as someone with a fluctuating experience of disability through chronic illness, and through community that I was making with just understanding the fluidity of people's experience between people as well as within people, I wanted to subvert that symbol of disability in the parking placard. And I thought that, hey, this would be like an easy thing to make out of paper. And so I started just making a lot of prints of just different physical experiences, mental experiences through these different disability representations in these different placards, to be like, how many different ways could I express my own experience, other people's experiences through this kind of drab, one-dimensional picture, and kind of create like this completely just constantly changing, malleable type of representation. And I think for me, something that was interesting going into printmaking that was difficult was I had gone in with this very perfectionist. I'm a perfectionist person. I want to do things right. I think in a way you have to be a perfectionist to love printmaking and be willing to do the same thing over and over again and not completely give up. But there was an element to which my energy was limited, my strength was limited. There was things that I was like, I felt very frustrated in the beginning. And I had this really incredible intaglio teacher at UNM named Yoshika Shimano. And she's this very tiny frame of a woman. And she was so inspiring because I was talking to her about this, and she's, you don't have to make big work that is a sign or a representation of brute strength. There's that kind of bravado in a lot of different art mediums, maybe sculpture in particular, printmaking too, where it's look at me with my enormous roller. And I'm like, I just can barely hold the small ones. And look at me, I make these enormous prints with a spoon. So she really introduced this idea of being able to make big work with small pieces that were manageable for me. And so that was really fun what the first impression series grew into, which was like then I started to have a couple hundred of these. Let me put them in kind of installation pieces that I think have more impact when you see the variation of the disability experience represented through the variation of all these prints, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful. Last thing you were saying about this urge that people have to flex on the physicality of any art medium. But in print, you say people are like, wow, look at the size of that woodcut. Look at this prosing with the giant roller, right? That's such a classic portrait for printmakers. And it reminds me a little bit, I worked in the commercial art world for a decade, and there was a phrase that was like, if you can't make it good, make it big. If you can't make it big, make it red. If you want to sell it, that idea, which, and not to poo in any way, like people who have the large physicality practice, but something I've always said is a real beauty about printmaking is its intimacy, is its, you hold it close to your face. It can be often really small and detailed. It can be an experience that really one person can have at a time, even. I remember going to a exhibition at the Seattle Art Museum, I think it was a Dieu exhibition. It was Dieu or Rembrandt. Oh, such a bad historian, I can't remember. But it was these historical pieces that were framed in these big fancy frames, but still you had to queue to stand in front of it and have that one-on-one experience with it. Whereas you go to see Botticelli's Birth of Venus, it's massive. There's 30, 40, 50, 60 people in that room, all experiencing it in a really similar way. And I think to ignore the power of the intimacy of print and what it can offer as well is missing something that is not a bug. It is a feature of what we do. Yeah. So that's really interesting to hear that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's something I really leaned into with this series. I think with all of my prints, but this series in particular, because I think I'm a linguist, so I like puns. But even with serious topics, I'm like, first impressions, it's a pun, this idea of making, but also your first impression of someone that you're meeting, and the idea of the visibility versus invisibility of different disabilities and chronic illnesses, and the kind of, that was definitely a cognitive dissonance that was weird to reckon with in the beginning of some of my experiences. Was before I used a mobility aid, maybe I'm not clocked and as having a physical disability, but in many ways my experience was the same. I'm like, I'm just as tired, I'm having just as much pain, I'm having just as much trouble getting up these stairs. And so I really, with this series, wanted to incorporate like blind embossment of different types of mobility aids, different kind of symbols of medical paraphernalia, if you will, blood pressure, syringes, pill bottles, etc., these kinds of things. And it really is this intimate thing because I feel like you see the work from afar. And in this case, this iteration at the Contemporary Print, it's really big. It's 88 prints. Gosh, I should know the exact dimensions. I don't know, like 5 feet wide, 8 feet tall, about, or something. And so it is like imposing in some way, just because it's big, that that, like you're talking about, like the making an impression with size, but then you go closer and you see all this detail both in the prints, but then you can't see that embossment from far away. So it could just look like a figure, and then you're like, oh, that figure has a crutch, that figure has a walker. And so I really love that you have to get pretty close to see the whole picture. And I think that's a nice reflection of just the experience of being disabled in the world, and the way that people are constantly like perceiving you in different ways based on just what they see you with, what they do or do not see you with.
Yeah. And each piece also has some hand embroidery in it as well. So you've got blind embossing, printmaking, hand embroidering. Talk about that element and what that brings into each individual piece.
Yeah, I think embroidery is another thing I got into during the pandemic. I think I've been a sewer, did other kinds of fiber art, but never really embroidery. And it was a very peaceful practice during very stressful times in early pandemic days. And I really immediately wanted to bring that into my printmaking practice. I think similar to how the use of blind embossment was a nice way to highlight the invisibility of disability, that it can sometimes just not be tied to your physical body. It's tied to these other external things. For me, embroidery really was able to almost highlight more elusive things, like internal experience, like what does pain feel like? What does nausea look like? What does your kind of weird, fuzzy interactions with physical space in a disabled body look like? And not in just, I think that's the other part about this piece that was important to me. And I think is color, both in the ink, in the paper, in the embroidery especially, is adding a sense of joy and pride through a more kind of colorful representation as well, if that makes sense. I wanted each of the characters to have a lot of, I don't know, I think for me, the colors express a bit of joy because there's a lot of bright colors in it. And that maybe feels antithetical to what we think of as medical objects, medical aesthetics, as being like gray and white. So for me, I think embroidery really was able to touch on those different things. And then from a more processed side, similar to printmaking, it's so tedious. I wish that I didn't fall in love with two tedious mediums, because in comparison, this just takes forever. But for me, that is the meditation in it, is sitting down and really slowly sitting with the piece and letting the kind of feeling that is coming through to me and how the final print came about come through in the embroidery. I think that this one is reflective of chronic pain, and how can I manifest that in adding interesting stitching to it.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating undertaking, this idea of visualizing that internal experience of, as you say, like pain or nausea, discomfort, because I feel like that can be such an isolating experience, because it's just you and your body trying to tell you something and that you have absolutely no control over in that moment what you're experiencing, what you're not experiencing. And it's can be really humbling and scary, and can have that experience for you. No one can take some of that away from you when you're in it. And so I feel like the idea of creating a visual representation of it is really beautiful, because I feel like we feel less alone through communicating. We feel less alone through being seen. And so, yeah, that undertaking of I'm going to find a way to represent this really intimate experience visually is really powerful. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that it was so important to me to make all of them really different. And some of them are very reflective of my own experience and the fluidity and variation of my own various symptoms or experiences. Again, I think it's not limited to symptomology, it's also just your kind of mental, emotional reaction to these experiences, like the feeling of just being in space that just is fundamentally different when you have trouble standing for a long time or you can't use stairs and you're just tied to space in this way that's not always visible or shared by other people in around you in the room with you. And so to, like you said, I think make that visible in different ways is really freeing. And one of the most beautiful parts about having worked on this series for so long and had a few iterations of the installation is really meeting other people who resonate with it from a lived experience, and the ones that people are very much attached to and that everybody like feels seen in a certain way by at least one of them. And very surprising ways, like that has been, I think the initial kernel of what made me want to do this project was deeply personal. And as I have continued with it, it has become so much more about the people I get to connect with who just share their stories and experiences, or when people get to take one home and it's the one that really spoke to them. It's like the absolute best feeling.
Yeah. Yeah, I did my undergraduate degree in philosophy, and one of the 400 level courses I took was philosophy of disability, which is really like maybe has stayed with me more than any other course I've taken in my undergrad, and learned a lot of things in it. But one of them was that, generally speaking, we position disability as an othering when it actually is fundamentally human experience.
Mm-hmm.
That we somehow imagine that what a human is a 22-year-old fully able-bodied person with no chronic pain and no mental health issues. And then, but that is, of course, not the case. If people were saying that, it's one of the phrases that came up in the course is, it's not abled and disabled, it's disabled and currently abled. If you live long enough, you are going to experience something. And so it's not surprising to hear that so many people connect with at least one of your offerings of these pieces, because you've lived long enough, you've experienced something, some sort of something on the spectrum of that experience. And it varies greatly, of course, person to person, but it's an inevitable part of living and interacting with the world. Yeah.
And I think that idea that, like you said, disability can be really fundamentally isolating, I think, because of the way our society is structured and wants us to feel about
Mm.
it. But to me, the greatest gift has been the community that I've come into because of it, and the change in relationship with myself, and even reckoning with not identifying as disabled due to mental illness and being in a mental institution for depression as a kid, and these different things that you're like, gosh, how did I think that wasn't part of this story, this like spectrum of experience, grappling with a lot of deep ableism from the side of then it's all these experiences are different and dealing with physical limitation is different. But I really wanted to want to make sure in my work that even though I'm not trying to like code the real experiences that are hard, that can be because of the actual condition thing you're experiencing, or because of just the way in which our society is structured to limit our access to things other people have, that there's still so much joy in being connected to your mind and body in a different, I'd argue, in some ways deeper, interconnected with other community. The disabled experience is at its root, I think, when we can look at it in a more nuanced way, is about collective care and our relationships with each other. And it's very easy, at least it was for me, being a more physically able-bodied person earlier in my life, to just very much do that. Go, I'm going to work harder. I'm going to do more. I'm going to not listen to my body, and just think that was okay. And it's interesting that the gift of having some physical limitations now is that I take such better care of myself in all these other ways. And I'm trying to tread carefully here because I don't want to make it sound like it's just a perfect experience without grief of things that you lose, but you have so much else that you've gained. And I always want to express that in my art practice as well, that it's a balance of both.
Yeah. Yeah. Like many human experiences. And I think It's one of the most amazing and fascinating things about being a person is, I think, hearing other people's stories about things that they thought would have been world ending that end up being a doorway into an expanded version of themselves that they knew they never would have gotten to somewhere else.
It was an interesting parallel just through understanding how I wanted to interact with printmaking as a medium like I do now, and reckoning with these different kind of feelings and changing ideologies around health and ability. And it was funny to bring that perspective into printmaking, going back to this, not just the, I don't know, expression of strength or grit and brawn or whatever, but also in the perfection. There was a couple times where it was like I was really seeking after, oh my gosh, the surface of my copper to start has to be like pristine. I can't use something that's scratched. I remember like being really upset because I couldn't lift something and ended up like scratching my like litho plate and was like, oh, and this is unusable now. And a couple experiences like that of just feeling really frustrated. And at first, I'm not physically cut out to do this. It's just too physically demanding. And maybe there's not a workaround. And beyond just trying to make smaller work and maybe piece it together to make bigger work or even just focus on smaller pieces as well, was this idea of using kind of flaws in print surfaces as more of a feature, not discarding prints. That's why I also like mono printing in a way, because it like made me embrace the imperfections more. I think printmakers like to say that, right? But we also don't really do that in practice sometimes, right? It's the aggravating thing, even going back to like screen printing, where I'd want to get everything to line up so perfectly. And it was always like someone liked the ugly print better. They're like, it looks like it's moving. And you're like, no, that's a bad print. You should not do the light of day. And then to have my kind of mentality shift because of all these things I was experiencing with my own health and have that kind of carry over into this developing practice was super interesting. Like, I want to say, oh yeah, I was super conscious. I don't think it was conscious at first. And then it was like, I would love to use discarded pieces of copper or like discarded things, like things that are scratched, are imperfect, and push that forward as a medium in its own right. Like really highlighting the imperfections as a way of just sort of, or I'm tired and I just can't print more. And so this is what this edition is going to be. Peace with that, which sounds odd, but in a way it's so enfolded into the practice now that it's hard to tell what came first. But I think just really embracing imperfection in the process of printmaking feels like it's a further kind of expression of just my own kind of physicality, my own body, mind.
Yeah, you had that really beautiful phrase earlier in our conversation about printmaking being an extension of your disabled body. And that's that through line, I'm guessing. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, exactly. I think I had a lot of cast off pieces from the First Impression series. That uses a bunch of different printmaking techniques, not just intaglio, but doing some collagraphs and some monotypes, and more specifically. But I did end up with some different kind of cast off copper pieces from cutting these shapes out with the copper, which I enjoy doing. I think being able to use the scraps in that way, because of the cutting process, I'm left with all these irregular, weird, half scraped pieces. And so the show that I did with Echo a couple years ago was born out of that, with this self-portrait series, and being like, I really want to highlight these cast-off pieces that have fallen on my garage floor and are still and worthy of shaping and making into an extension of myself.
I want to make sure, too, that we've got a little bit of time to talk about the linguistics side of what you do. So you mentioned it coming into your work a little bit. You said through your love of puns. And I think like many things that people say, like linguistics, as we mentioned, the sort of the top of the hour, it's a big house, right? There's many different things you can do. Can you just maybe start by talking about what your research interest is specifically within that larger field? And then we can maybe talk about how it cycles into your visual practice.
Definitely. I think maybe unsurprisingly, because I was coming into linguistics at the same time as I was coming into fine art printmaking, I was having the same interests around disability. And I really fell in love with sociolinguistics, which is looking at more like just how different aspects of how we socialize, our social identities, rather interact with our language. Do they affect our language use, how we interact with each other? How do we even convey these social constructs like gender or disability through language more broadly? And so that's really been the focus of my research, is looking at how we express disabled identity in different ways through language. And so that's what I've been focusing on. And I think because of doing so much more like academic research into that area and into like disability studies more broadly, it's been great because it really informed my work, maybe in some ways indirectly, but in the more like conceptual framework of the things I was trying to get across. And thinking about printmaking as the more visual communication side, and how that kind of overlaps with language.
Yeah. Can you, just for if anyone at home heard that and they're like, that sounds fascinating, I don't really know what that means.
Yeah.
Could you, yeah, could you give like an example maybe of the ways in which language forms limited structures around like maybe what we think about disability or just something? Yeah. An example,
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
I think something that people often talk about is maybe disability metaphors that are really
Mm,
embedded in language and where they come from, or what kind of ideas about disability they perpetuate. Say, if we have a lot of disability related words that are like negative modifiers, negative
right.
adjectives, like crazy, insane, lame, what does that tell us about kind of society's broader conceptualizations of disability? Because we use these kind of, in some cases, metaphorical. Other linguists might say that's not always metaphorical usage, but that's probably not that many linguists listening to the printmaking podcast. If they are, I would listen to them because we have a lot to talk about. For me, I've been looking at actually more like disability labeling. So I think probably a lot of people, most people I would say, are familiar with the kind of language debate, political correctness debate around disability specifically, talking about like person first language, or saying person with a disability versus disabled person, or not even having the noun in there at all, like the disabled or
Mm-hmm.
or something like that. And so looking at, there's this term that people talk a lot about with not just disability terms, but disability in particular, is this idea of the euphemistic or the euphemism treadmill, this idea that like someone is, this word has a negative connotation, it's stigmatizing, so we need to discard it for this new, fresh, shiny new word or phrase that's like untainted by stigma. And we're going to use that, and that's going to fix our stigmatized attitudes towards this group of people because we're going to use this shiny new word. And while I'm a big proponent in the power of language to shape conceptions about identity and groups of people and self, it is only half of the story, I feel, because you can, if the stigma is still there around a group of people and isn't addressed in other ways, just slapping a new label on it, especially if that label isn't always like the label that group wants, right?
Right.
Because there's kind of debate around that too. Like, not everyone is, yeah, I want person first language. That's not a preference that that many disabled people want. That then the stigma is going to attach to the new term eventually and have to be discarded. We could
Mm-hmm.
think about like idiot or imbecile or these different words that were like somewhat neutral medical terms at one point and then like become pejorative over time. And so I'm just really interested in looking at that process. And again, that's not to discount the power of language, because I think it's really important, but to see the kind of like imperfect way. Like, one idea is that person first language is used more exclusively for children or for
Hmm.
more stigmatized disabilities, people that we deem more worthy of protecting potentially on like the child end, or maybe with mental illness being more stigmatizing. So maybe like person first language is going to become actually stigmatizing or more associated with stigma and thus perceived as more stigmatizing. So that was maybe too much detail.
No,
But
no,
so
that was like great, really concrete example. So I feel like that's super helpful. Yeah.
yeah, so exploring that, I think also the University of New Mexico, where I'm at, our department is really focused on looking at usage. So not just being like on the theory side, but what are people actually doing with language? And I think that's where the most fascinating information is, because or insights are, because you're actually seeing that, wow, it's people have these maybe prescriptive ideas of we should do this would be good, and then it's really imperfectly executed and has these interesting consequences for meaning. That's just really fascinating to me.
Yeah, that's so interesting, that distinction that you were speaking to about how very well-meaning people will say, let's update the word that we use in an attempt to just erase stigma without
Right.
doing anything. Yeah, to have the sort of underlying stigma and the underlying social structures that cause it, or make life more difficult for people.
Literal lip service, I think, sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, the truest form of it. Yeah, absolutely. And that, yeah, that it creeps in. That's just such an interesting idea. And so you're saying that it informs the way that you can think theoretically about your work. With that being said, do you feel like you have any projects or things in your visual art on your horizon that you'd like to do that is coming directly from this research or indirectly from it?
Yeah, I think I haven't quite landed on the more direct way I want to represent this. I think I look at a lot of what we call, I like doing corpus linguistics, or looking at like huge bodies of text that are supposed to represent natural language because they're taken from spoken language, and news articles and academic writing. And you can do these word searches of billions of words and see, oh, well, someone's always using person first language versus the what's often called identity first language with more negative adjectives or something. So you can kind of mulling about the best way to visualize in a more abstract and artistic sense this idea of the shape of words or the shape of labels based on the words that they collocate with. But on the more like indirect side, I've been working on a really fun project that I feel like really pushed me to think a little bit more collectively than from just my individual experience, and really trying to lean into like my researcher side, which is a project I've been calling prior authorization, which is going to be a series of like data portraits, in the sense that I've gotten a collection of other disabled and chronically ill people to make a log of all of the time that they spend on what I'm calling kind of medical admin. So that might be like on the
Mm.
more insurance admin side, that might, a category would be like actually receiving care and then doing your kind of daily personal healthcare tasks or what have you. And I did it for the entirety of 2024, which was an absolute
Wow.
wild. And it was like really cathartic and what's the word, affirming in a weird way, to be like, I spent like over 20 hours on hold with my insurance company like over the
Yeah.
last, just like clocking the hold time versus the on the phone time. And so I'm excited to lean into a lot more kind of academic research background for this project around the history of the medical system in and insurance in particular in the US, and the sort of like historical shifting of like medical admin labor onto disabled bodies, and trying to express that again, maybe almost a parallel to the like blind embossment of these things that aren't always seen but are like so present, is like visualizing like unpaid labor, visualizing lost time
Mm-hmm.
that is so unrelated in its at its core to the actual experience of your health issues, like the fact that we have to
Mm-hmm.
do this, the fact that it's being outsourced to patients in this systemic way, and trying to visualize that.
Yeah. That's really hitting home for me, for sure, hearing that. One of my primary motivators in not living in the United States anymore is not having to engage in that system anymore. Like, it's
Yeah,
just,
I think that's
it's,
so
yeah.
true for so many people. It's just, it's hard for everyone. And then you add a complication of just needing to access more care or more complex care. And it's just like astronomical. And last year, my aunt-in-law was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and my partner and I were her primary caregivers until she passed. And dealing with that, in addition to another family member passing, and being involved on the caretaking side and tracking that time, and just being even more in the medical meat grinder, the insurance meat grinder, if you will. It's mind-boggling to me that we accept that as okay. And that kind of goes back to that idea of temporarily able-bodied, or TAB, I think I've heard, versus
Mm-hmm.
disabled. this idea that you think it can't happen to you. And so I guess that's why we just accept it, because those of us that are getting so ground down by it are like too tired to, I don't want to say too tired to fight, because that's almost completely ignoring all of the amazing disability activism, but that the burden is placed on the people with almost like less energy reserves in so many ways to do that fight. And that's very similar across all kinds of social issues. But it is upsetting, especially coming out of just different ideas from the pandemic and going through that experience collectively and individually, that we could go through all of that and people still just be like, we couldn't make it better. I mean, I don't want to say that people want it to be better, but also the fact that we don't all collectively fight because it's this idea of you're medically vulnerable or predisposed, pre-existing conditions, and that can't happen to me, and therefore that's something that those people deal with. Something I hope shifts.
Yeah, I'm thinking about just an experience that I probably think maybe a fair amount of people have had, is that experience of when you're finally at the point where you admit that you need to get some mental health support, and then trying to get it while you're diminished to the point that you finally admitted to yourself that you need it. It's pretty sick, where you're just like, I have to try and figure out my insurance. I have to research this person. I have to figure out if they take it. I have to see if they are accepting new patients in the next 6 months. You're doing all of that while you're feeling so already lacking resources. It's really wild. So it's like, it feels like you need to be like fully mentally operational in order to get help for when you're not feeling fully mentally operational.
Exactly. They're like, you just plan your mental breakdown in advance so that you can jump through all of the your insurance requires, and then hopefully they approve it. Yeah, that was a wild part, even like going to the Mayo Clinic and something that was like planned over many years of all the hoops you have to jump through to get approvals and all these things. And I was like, in what other industry? It felt like going into a car dealership and being like, I need a car, but I don't know much about cars. So will you tell me what kind of car I want? And they're like, sure, features that we'll have, and we don't know how much it's going to cost. We're just going to buy it, and then we'll give you a bill later, and you'll just have to pay for that car. That's what the experience like this. And that's coming from also like the incredible place of privilege of getting to go there and having certain insurance tests that I was able to pass, so to speak, to be able to go there and even feel like it was going to be okay to take that leap of faith financially. But it's just a wild, unbelievably broken system, and something that I think more people are talking about, right? The Luigi of it all, but also I think more people are just reckoning with the effects of COVID, especially. And it's just slower going, I think, in terms of people understanding the need for collective power for this issue, that it can't, that we can't stop thinking about it like an individual GoFundMe. It's not tenable. It's not empowering for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I feel like I could talk for another hour just on that, because it's just, oh man, once you start pulling that string, it's so much. I love that turn of phrase, the Luigi of it all. Like it's such a beautiful encapsulation of it. Yeah. We've come up to our hour recording mark, and this has been really wonderful talking with you. And so I'd love to invite you to let people know where they can find you and see your work and follow you and be up to date on the projects that you're going to continue to put out into the world.
People can find me online on Instagram at Matron Studio. That's also my website, so matronstudio.com, which I'll have updates about this upcoming body of work, which would be great. And if anyone's interested in his local, I'll be teaching actually an embroidery, a printmaking embroidery workshop at Remark here in Albuquerque in April. So I'm very excited about that, bridging those two worlds with embroidery and printmaking. I hope I get to do more of that because it's very fun.
Very cool. Very cool. And the contemporary print is up in Austin. So if anyone is in Austin, they can see your work in person there. It's at the art galleries of the Austin Community College, and it's up through March 20th. So cool. Awesome. Thank you so much again. And I'm excited to share our conversation and excited to follow your work with interest.
Oh, thank you. It was really great talking with you.
If you like today's episode, we have a Patreon where you can help support this podcast and get bonus content like Shop Talk shorts with past guests. But the best thing you can do to support this podcast is listen, rate, follow, and share with your fellow print friends around the world. This episode, like all episodes, was written and produced by me, Miranda Metcalf, with editing by Timothy Pauschak and music by Joshua Weber. I'll see you in 2 weeks.